The first thing my younger brother did after the vote was smile for the cameras. Not at me. At the shareholders. He straightened the cuff of his navy suit, the one I'd bought him for his first investor conference, back when he still asked me which fork to use at dinner, and cleared his throat like a man about to accept an award. As of this moment, Ethan said, the board has officially voted to remove Ms. Caroline Hayes as Chief Executive Officer. There was applause. Not loud. Just enough to make the decision feel civilized, the way a funeral home plays soft music so grief doesn't seem so raw. Across the polished walnut table, my Aunt Denise folded her hands and lowered her eyes for exactly as long as sympathy required, and not a second more. "I'm sorry it had to end this way," she said softly. She wasn't sorry. She had been planning this meeting for months, and everyone in the room except me seemed to know it. Legal counsel slid a folder toward me. "Mrs. Hayes, we'll need your company laptop, building access card, and any confidential documents before you leave today." I didn't touch the folder. Not yet. Outside the glass walls, nearly 200 employees had gathered in silence. Some looked confused. Others wouldn't meet my eyes at all. No one had expected the founder of Hayes Biotech to be walked out of her own headquarters, least of all by her own family. Ethan leaned back in his chair, comfortable in a way he'd never quite managed as a boy. "You've always said the company comes before personal feelings." He let that land, watching several board members nod along. "So let's be professional." Professional. I almost laughed out loud. 12 years earlier, professional had meant sleeping on a worn-out couch inside a rented laboratory because we couldn't afford both office space and an apartment. It had meant signing payroll checks for everyone else while postponing my own salary for nearly 9 months. It had meant mortgaging the house my late husband and I had spent years saving for, because the company needed one more round of clinical trials before it could stand on its own. None of the people at this table had been there for any of it. Not Denise, not Ethan, not one board member now acting as though they'd built this company beside me from the beginning. Back then, Ethan couldn't read a balance sheet without asking where the revenue line was. Now he was lecturing investors about governance. Confidence grows fast, I thought, once someone else has already carried the weight. "Our attorneys have prepared the transition documents," Denise continued. "If you sign today, everyone can move forward peacefully." Peacefully. The word floated through the room like expensive perfume, meant to cover an unpleasant smell rather than remove it. I finally opened the folder. It was thick. Termination agreement. Confidentiality reminder. Non-disparagement clause. Stock transfer authorization. That last page almost made me smile. Almost. And I turned the pages slowly, one at a time, while no one spoke. They probably thought I was finally absorbing how completely I'd lost. I hadn't lost anything yet. I just hadn't decided how much of it I was willing to let them see. Ethan checked his watch. "Caroline, this doesn't have to become embarrassing." Embarrassing. He still believed that was my biggest concern. I looked up for the first time since the meeting had started. "Did you read every document before approving today's agenda?" He frowned. "Of course." "Every attachment?" "Yes." "Even Exhibit G?" Silence. A tiny one. Less than 2 seconds. But I'd spent a decade negotiating licensing deals, and I'd learned exactly how to read the movements people can't control. A tightened jaw, a delayed blink, a hand pulling back from the table half a second too fast. The company's lawyer did all 3 at once. The chairman cleared his throat. "If there are no further objections—" "There is one," I said. Every face turned toward me. I closed the folder gently, instead of slamming it, because I wanted them to remember how calm I was when this conversation finally caught up with them. "I won't challenge today's vote," I said. Ethan visibly relaxed. "But I'd like confirmation of one simple fact before I leave, that everyone voting today understood exactly which assets this company actually owns." Several directors exchanged confused glances. One reached for the annual report, as if the answer might be printed there. "We know exactly what this company owns," Ethan said, smiling again. "No," I said quietly. "You know what the balance sheet says. That isn't the same thing." I looked once more at the framed photograph hanging near the boardroom entrance. Opening day, 6 employees, 1 folding table, a borrowed microscope, everyone grinning like the future hadn't decided yet whether to be kind to us. Only one person in that photograph had signed the original intellectual property agreements. Me. Not the company. Me. It had seemed like a technicality 12 years ago, when no bank believed we'd survive long enough for it to matter. Today, it was something else entirely. I stood, collected my bag, and left the laptop exactly where it was. I hope, I said, looking at my brother one last time, that whoever advised you to fire the founder remembered to read every contract she signed. No one spoke as I crossed the room. No one applauded. The silence followed me all the way to the elevator, and as the doors closed, I realized I wasn't grieving the company I'd just lost. I was grieving the brother I'd spent half my life trying to protect. The company could be rebuilt. Families were harder. People imagine family businesses collapse in a single dramatic argument. Ours didn't. Ours came apart so slowly that for years I mistook it for ordinary growing pains, and I can now point to a dozen small moments that should have made me stop, each one too small, at the time, to be worth a fight. My name is Caroline Hayes. I founded Hayes Biotech 11 years before my own board voted me out, though it was never a childhood dream. I'd planned on a career inside university laboratories, where molecules behaved according to rules and data either supported a theory or it didn't. People were harder. My husband David used to joke that I could explain gene sequencing to a room of investors, but couldn't tell when someone was lying to my face. He wasn't wrong. He balanced me in ways I didn't fully appreciate until cancer took him, noticing my moods before I said a word, remembering birthdays I forgot, calming furious clients without ever raising his voice, quietly setting a sandwich beside my keyboard while I worked through dinner. When David died, our daughter Emma was 14. I was 43. For almost a year, neither of us really remembered how to breathe. The company became more than a business after that. It became the one place I still felt connected to the future David and I had planned together. Every new hire, every product launch, every lab expansion felt like a promise we'd managed to keep. Maybe that's why I never questioned helping my younger brother. Ethan was 7 years younger, and he'd followed me everywhere as a kid. When our parents divorced, I learned to cook because someone had to, helped him with homework because our mother worked 2 jobs, paid for another semester when he wanted to quit college after failing accounting, and quietly covered his debt when his first business collapsed, before creditors could ruin him. I never kept count. That's what older sisters do, or so I believed. By the time Hayes Biotech turned profitable, Ethan had settled into marketing. He wasn't brilliant, and he wasn't reckless. He simply had the one quality investors love. People liked him instantly. In 5 minutes, he could remember your children's names, compliment your watch, and make you feel like an old friend. I preferred spreadsheets, clinical data, patent filings. He preferred conference dinners and golf tournaments. Together we made an effective team, or so everyone believed, including me. Our Aunt Denise entered the picture a little later, 30 years as a corporate lawyer before retiring, or so she claimed, since retirement mostly meant attending every shareholder meeting and offering opinions nobody had asked for. "You're growing too fast," she'd say, or, "Investors don't like founder dependence." Sometimes she praised me. "You've built something remarkable." And sometimes she planted a small, deniable doubt in the very next sentence. I never argued. Some advice was useful. None of it felt dangerous. Not yet. Emma actually liked her in those days. She called her Aunt D, and Denise always arrived with expensive chocolate, designer notebooks, books Emma had mentioned once, months earlier. Looking back, I wonder if generosity was simply another way of collecting loyalty before anyone needed to spend it. At 16, Emma started helping at the office after school, organizing files, prepping presentation packets, wearing her visitor badge like it made her part of something important. I'd sometimes find her outside Laboratory 3, watching the scientists through the glass. "You miss Dad today?" I'd ask, and she'd nod without speaking. We'd go back to work. Not every wound needed explaining. One Friday evening, pizza boxes covering half the conference table, Emma looked up from her calculus homework and said, without much weight in her voice, "You know, Uncle Ethan says investors think you'd be happier doing research full-time." It sounded harmless. Maybe it was. It stayed with me anyway. The following Monday, Ethan appeared with 2 coffees, one for me, one exactly the way David used to order his, hazelnut, extra hot. "I've been thinking," he said, sitting across from me. "You need to start delegating." I told him I delegated plenty. "You delegate work," he said. "You don't delegate authority, the public-facing stuff, media, board meetings, investor relations. You hate those anyway." He wasn't wrong. I told him I'd think about it. and that answer made him surprisingly, almost suspiciously happy. At the time I assumed he wanted to help. Now I know he was measuring how easily I could be moved. Over the following year, small changes accumulated. Ethan represented the company at more conferences. He became the face in magazine interviews. Business journals began describing him as the executive driving the company's growth. I noticed, and I didn't care. Every hour he spent talking to investors was an hour I spent in the lab, and to me it felt like a fair trade. To everyone watching from the outside, it looked as though leadership had quietly changed hands. Denise encouraged it, always in reasonable-sounding language. Founders need successors, she'd say. Markets like continuity. Perfectly reasonable advice. Until the day it wasn't. One autumn afternoon, Emma walked into my office, holding the employee newsletter. "Mom, did they print the wrong picture?" The front page showed Ethan standing outside headquarters under the headline, "Leading Hayes Biotech into its next era." "They probably just needed a recent photo," I said. "But you're the CEO," she said. "It's not a competition," I told her. She set the page down without answering, and I wish now I'd listened more carefully, because somewhere between the smiling magazine covers and the board dinners I skipped, and the governance conversations Denise loved so much, people had quietly stopped asking who founded Hayes Biotech. They'd started asking when Ethan would officially take over. I didn't hear the question yet. Someone else already had, and they'd started building an answer. The first warning didn't arrive with an accusation. It arrived with a signature. If you'd asked me then whether I trusted my brother, I'd have answered without hesitation. Yes. If you'd asked about my aunt, I'd have said I was careful around her, but believed she wanted what was best for the company. Neither answer would have been completely true. The crack appeared on a rainy Tuesday morning. My assistant Laura knocked softly before opening my office door. She almost never interrupted meetings, which alone caught my attention, and stepped inside holding a thin blue folder. "I wasn't sure whether this belonged in legal or finance," she said. Inside was a board authorization, raising the financial threshold under which Ethan could negotiate partnerships without my approval. Nothing unusual, on its face. Except, I'd never approved raising that threshold, and there, at the bottom, was my signature. Clean. Perfect. Exactly like the one on every official filing. Too perfect. That evening I unlocked the leather folder I kept of my own signed documents. An old habit David used to tease me about. "You don't trust computers? I trust people even less," I'd told him, laughing. I wasn't joking, it turned out. I laid 3 old signatures beside the new authorization. Same pressure, same curve beneath the C. But something about it felt less like a signature and more like a very careful reproduction of one. A habit performed by someone who hadn't spent a lifetime performing it. I told myself I was imagining things. Grief does strange things to attention. But I walked down to legal anyway. Denise barely glanced at the page. "Oh yes, we updated Ethan's signing authority. I don't remember approving it. You did, last month. I'd like to see the minutes." She poured 2 coffees while we waited, mentioning, almost gently, that I'd been forgetting things lately. Cancelled meetings, repeated questions, asking twice whether we'd renewed the Zurich contract. Had I? I honestly couldn't say. Running a growing company meant 100 conversations a week. Anyone could lose track. Couldn't they? The minutes arrived. Approval recorded. Motion passed. Everything dated to a governance meeting I supposedly attended by video. Except I'd been delivering a keynote in Boston that morning and had flown home right after lunch, before the meeting even started. "Maybe you're mixing up the dates," Denise offered. Maybe I was. That was what made her dangerous. She never pushed. She suggested. By the time I left legal, I wasn't suspicious of her. I was questioning myself, and that bothered me more than the document ever could. 2 weeks later, I found Emma sitting on the back porch long after dinner, still in her school sweatshirt in the cold. "You okay?" She nodded. "Just thinking." Eventually she said, "I don't really fit there anymore." At the office, she meant. People asked her whether Uncle Ethan was busy, told her he'd probably be CEO soon, and they'd stopped asking about me at all. That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have, because employees don't change how they talk overnight. They change after hearing the same message often enough that it starts to sound like fact. The third warning came from someone who didn't realize she'd given it. Laura mentioned booking the executive conference room for a Friday leadership alignment meeting. Board, legal, finance, communications. Not research. Not me. When I called Ethan, His voice stayed light, almost cheerful, the way it might if we were discussing dinner reservations rather than a board strategy session I hadn't been told about. "You don't need to be," he said, when I asked why I wasn't invited. I laughed, thinking he was joking. He didn't laugh back. When I checked the calendar, the meeting had been scheduled 3 weeks earlier. Every senior executive had accepted. There was no invitation with my name on it at all. Not declined, not expired. Simply never sent. For the first time since David died, I felt alone. And somewhere else in the building, someone had already started planning the next move. At 8:58 the following Friday, I walked into the executive conference room without knocking. Conversation stopped. Not dramatically, just long enough for everyone to notice I wasn't supposed to be there. Ethan stood by the screen, sleeves rolled the way David used to roll his, and for one unfair second, that gesture hit me harder than anything else that morning. Then he smiled. "Morning? You forgot to invite me. I didn't think you'd want another 3-hour finance meeting. You decided that for me?" I was trying to help. No one in the room looked at either of us. Denise closed her binder. "Caroline, perhaps we should avoid creating unnecessary tension." Unnecessary. Her favorite word for anything she wanted dismissed without discussing. I asked our CFO, Martin, whether he'd known I wasn't invited. "I assumed the two of you had already discussed it," he said, and of course he had. Nobody wanted to believe the CEO had been excluded on purpose, because believing that would force them to ask why. I left before anyone could answer, and asked one question on my way out. "Who approved today's agenda?" "The governance committee," Denise said. I asked for the minutes. She said she'd have legal send them. She never did. Laura was waiting outside my office with the morning's mail. Most of it was routine. Quarterly reports, proxy statements, except one already opened envelope from a long-time institutional investor. "Congratulations to Ethan on stepping into greater leadership," it read. "We look forward to supporting his vision for the company's next chapter." Someone had clearly told our investors that a transition was already underway. Nobody had told me. That night, over reheated leftovers, Emma asked if Ethan and I were fighting. "We disagree sometimes," I said. She stirred her food without eating. "I heard him on the phone yesterday," she said. "He said, once she's completely out of operations, the board won't resist. He walked away when he saw me." "Maybe he was talking about another company," I offered. She looked at me carefully. "You don't believe that." Neither did I. Denise invited me to lunch the following Monday, at a quiet restaurant where conversation disappeared beneath soft piano music. She'd already ordered grilled salmon for herself, chicken salad for me, because she always remembered what people liked, which made them feel cared for right up until it didn't. "The board has noticed you've become distant," she said. "You delegate more. You avoid investor dinners. You leave early some afternoons." "I leave to have dinner with my daughter." "Exactly," she said, as though I'd made her point for her. "No one blames you. Family comes first." It sounded supportive. It wasn't. Supportive people don't quietly build a case against you while pretending to comfort you. "They're concerned the company may have outgrown founder management," she said. "Whose opinion is that?" "The board's." "Which board member said it first?" "It doesn't matter," she said, though it did, because ideas don't appear on their own. Someone plants them, someone repeats them, someone waters them until they look like they grew naturally. What she actually wanted, once she finally said it plainly, was 6 months. Rest. Let Ethan handle executive leadership. Temporarily. "Would I still be CEO?" I asked. "On paper," she said. "On paper. Not in reality." "In reality, Ethan would run the company, and I would keep a title with nothing behind it." "No," I told her. "Then think about Emma," she said. "Not my career, my daughter," because she knew exactly where I'd never let my guard down. 3 days later, the weekly executive report arrived with a new distribution list. Ethan first, then the board, then Denise. My name came forth. A tiny mistake, except it wasn't a mistake at all. Leadership isn't taken in one dramatic moment. It's transferred one assumption at a time, one meeting, one newsletter, one distribution list, until everyone forgets there was ever another way. Nobody ever accused me of a crime. Nobody questioned my intelligence. Instead, they built a version of me that sounded reasonable, a woman who had simply become too emotionally attached to the company she created. It worked, because there was truth buried inside it. Of course I was attached. My husband's fingerprints were still on our earliest lab notebooks. Love became the weapon they used against me. It started in an executive committee meeting, almost off the agenda. "I think we should reduce founder dependence," Ethan said, reviewing manufacturing costs. Nobody reacted. It sounded like standard language. Martin nodded. "Many investors prefer institutional leadership," and Denise added, almost absent-mindedly, that companies grow healthier once they stop being centered on one individual. Nobody looked at me. They didn't need to. The sentence had already done its work. Founder dependence sounded like a structural weakness in a business, not an attack on a person. I wrote the phrase down anyway, because something about it felt rehearsed. At an investor dinner in Chicago that I insisted on attending myself, a man I'd known for 8 years leaned in over dessert. "I'm glad you're finally slowing down." I told him I'd never said that. "Ethan told us you'd been talking about stepping away," he said, his smile fading. I must have misunderstood. He hadn't. Someone had wanted him to believe exactly that. The next morning, Laura placed a business magazine on my desk, open to an interview with Ethan headlined, "Preparing Hayes Biotech for the Future." Buried in it was a line that never used my name, and didn't need to. Leadership isn't about holding on to titles forever, and every founder eventually has to recognize when the company needs a different kind of energy. The interview had been recorded 3 weeks earlier, the same week I wasn't invited to the leadership meeting, the same week investors started congratulating my brother, the same week signing authority quietly changed. Separate events. One direction. I confronted him in his office. "You told investors I was stepping down." "I never said that. I talked about succession planning. You talked about replacing me. Caroline, not sis, not anymore. You're reading too much into this." When our father died, I reminded him. "Our father," he corrected. I'd promised never to let emotion interfere with business. "I think you've forgotten," he said. There it was. Not incompetence. Not corruption. Emotion. A founder too invested in her own creation to be objective. Much harder to defend, because grief isn't measurable, and if enough people believed I was making emotional decisions, every disagreement could be waved away as another example of it. Then Karen from HR asked for a confidential conversation and closed the door before sitting down. "We've received concerns," she said. "Several employees feel uncomfortable challenging your decisions. Not that I'd yelled or threatened anyone, just that disagreeing with me had become difficult. Who filed them?" "They're anonymous." Of course they were. Impossible to verify, impossible to confront, impossible to defend against. Except months later, someone could say there had been concerns for quite some time, without ever proving a single one. That night, Emma asked whether people were trying to make me quit. "Because nobody argues with you anymore," she said. "They smile. They agree. Then they wait until you leave." She'd seen it happen twice. Once when Ethan started another meeting after I'd gone, and once when Denise told a room that founders don't always know when to let go. So Emma had heard the phrase too, repeated quietly enough that no one could ever point to a single attack. This wasn't character assassination. It was reputation replacement. They weren't convincing anyone I was a bad CEO. They were convincing everyone I'd become an outdated one, and the frightening part was that it was working. There's a moment in every betrayal when you stop asking whether it's happening, and start asking how long it's been happening, without you noticing. Mine came on an ordinary gray Wednesday, the labs humming exactly as they always did, and I no longer knew who was actually running my company. At the quarterly board meeting, Martin presented strong numbers, record licensing income, clinical milestones ahead of schedule, and mentioned Ethan's name 7 times in 20 minutes. Ethan negotiated this. Ethan approved that. I interrupted to ask why none of research's recommendations appeared anywhere in the deck. "They're in Appendix C," Martin said. "I never received Appendix C. Nobody could explain why. An administrative oversight," Denise offered. A phrase that explained everything and proved nothing. That evening my phone rang. "Martin, I shouldn't be calling," he said, voice tight. "Just be careful." "Careful of what?" "I can't say. Is someone breaking the law? I don't know enough." The line went dead. It told me almost nothing, and it confirmed everything. I wasn't imagining any of this. I started arriving before sunrise again, the way I used to. In Laboratory 3, Our senior scientist Emily looked surprised to see me. I thought Ethan said you'd be working from home more. I told her I'd never said that. I don't remember who told me, she said. And she did remember. She simply didn't want to be involved. People with mortgages don't volunteer for corporate wars. At lunch, I sat alone in the cafeteria I used to eat in every day, and watched 3 department heads gather around Ethan's table with documents and questions, nobody making a conscious decision to abandon me. Just drifting. The way people always drift toward whoever seems likely to make tomorrow's decisions. Not one person approached me about work. For the first time since founding the company, I felt like a guest inside it. Karen called again that afternoon. Someone reported that you've become increasingly withdrawn. I'm being reported for being quiet? The concern is about engagement. I asked if she honestly thought I was the problem, and instead of answering, she asked whether she could speak candidly. People no longer knew what to believe, she said. Some thought I was retiring, some thought I was starting another company, some thought I was only staying until after the next funding round. I'd never said any of it. Then why does everyone believe it? Because nobody ever denies them, she said. Rumors don't need proof. They need silence. A few days later, a young researcher named Daniel lingered after a meeting. Should we start reporting to Mr. Hayes instead? We heard the org chart is changing. Who told you that? I don't remember, he said. Another person who'd suddenly forgotten. Until you hear otherwise from me, nothing has changed, I told him. He nodded, unconvinced. So was I. That night, Emma found me sitting in David's old study for the first time in months, his fountain pen still exactly where he'd left it. She handed me a visitor badge she'd found under a chair after one of Ethan's meetings, someone's meeting notes scrawled on the back, mostly illegible except for one line. Board vote before Q4. Narrative must be complete first. Not financial review. Not governance. Narrative. Someone understood exactly what they were doing. That before removing me, they needed everyone to already believe removing me was inevitable. I wasn't dealing with isolated incidents anymore. I had the first piece of something real. Not enough to accuse anyone. Not enough to stop the board. But enough to know I wasn't losing my mind. Someone had a plan, and I was done waiting for them to write my story for me. Their first mistake was believing I'd react emotionally. Their second was believing I'd stop thinking like a scientist. Research had taught me to ask one question over and over. What does the evidence actually say? Not what people believed. Not what sounded convincing. For months, I'd been collecting emotions instead of evidence. It was time to switch back. I arrived before sunrise and went straight to the archive room, where every board packet and executive memo since the company's founding sat in gray filing cabinets nobody used anymore. I brought 3 legal pads, red for things that changed, blue for who benefited, black for evidence. And by noon, the pages were filling faster than I expected. Every change, without exception, increased Ethan's visibility. Never mine. Promotion by repetition, not by accomplishment. Laura found me there with coffee. People think you're preparing a lawsuit, she said quietly. A rumor that had reached administrative staff less than 4 hours after I'd sat down. Someone was watching, closely enough to report my movements, though not closely enough to stop me. I requested every governance committee agenda from the past 18 months. The legal assistant returned 20 minutes later, unsettled. We only have the final copies. The drafts were removed from the system. Digital systems always show who removed something. This one didn't, which wasn't standard procedure at all. In the hallway outside finance, I nearly collided with Martin. Exhausted. Tie loose. You shouldn't keep asking for old records. It makes people nervous. Then, unexpectedly, do you remember the Zurich licensing agreement? Who negotiated it? Personally. Every clause? I did, I said. He nodded slowly, like a man confirming something to himself, and walked away without explaining. That night I drove home in silence, and unlocked the small fireproof cabinet David had installed years earlier. I don't trust leaving everything at the office, he'd insisted, and carried a thick gray binder labeled International Licensing, Zurich to the kitchen table. Emma made tea, and called it treasure hunting. 3 hours in, buried inside Appendix 4, I found a note in David's handwriting. Never transfer without unanimous founder consent. Founder consent. There was only one founder. Me. I flipped back through the agreement and found a clause referring not to Hayes Biotech, but to an entity called Caroline Hayes Intellectual Holdings. The licensing rights had never been granted by the company. They'd been granted by a holding entity I'd created years earlier and almost entirely forgotten. The next morning, I called Harold Benson, our original outside attorney, retired nearly 5 years. He remembered instantly. The holding company, I drafted it, he said. Investors demanded protection, in case Hayes Biotech failed, that your research wouldn't disappear in bankruptcy. So the patents were licensed. Not assigned. Licensed, not assigned. 2 words that changed everything. If the patents had only ever been licensed, ownership might still exist somewhere the board had forgotten to look. Why are you asking now? Harold said. I told him I thought someone was trying to take my company. He was quiet for a moment, then asked the only question that mattered. Were they trying to take the company, or were they trying to take what they believed the company owned? I never answered, because for the first time since the board had started pushing me aside, I understood those might not be the same thing at all. I hadn't tested a hypothesis yet. I needed proof, not a hunch. So at 7 the next morning, I drove to Harold's small brick office on the east side of town. Gray hair, suspenders, towers of paper balanced everywhere, exactly as I remembered him. I wondered how long it would take before you came in person, he said. You sounded too calm on the phone. He'd already pulled a storage box of originals, partnership agreements, investment memoranda, patent filings, the entire early history of Hayes Biotech, which was really the entire history of my life. You remember why we created the holding company? He asked. Investors were nervous. They were terrified, he said, of failure. You had 1 lab, 6 employees, and a platform no bank believed would ever produce revenue, so the venture investors wanted your discoveries protected outside the operating business. But we became profitable. We expanded. We raised hundreds of millions. Why didn't we ever transfer ownership? Because you never asked, he said gently, and neither did anyone else. He opened the original intellectual property license agreement. 43 pages, my initials on every one. David's as witness. The investors' signatures preserved exactly as they'd been 12 years earlier. I went straight to the transfer provisions. Nothing. Assignment clauses, nothing. Then Harold pointed to Appendix 9. Ownership of all existing and future patent families shall remain exclusively with Caroline Hayes Intellectual Holdings, unless transferred through a separately executed assignment agreement signed by both parties. Where's the assignment? I asked. There isn't one, Harold said. I checked the amendments, the mergers, the financing rounds, the digital records, the patent office, still registered under your holding company. No assignment exists. 12 years of building one of the fastest-growing biotech companies in the country, and no one, not me, not legal, not the board, not Denise, not Ethan, had ever completed the final transfer. Don't celebrate, Harold warned. They can still remove you as CEO. They can still vote you off the board. But they cannot legally own what they never purchased. Back at headquarters, Laura was waiting with a printed email chain she said she wasn't supposed to have. Communications, then investor relations, then Ethan's approval. Subject line, post-transition messaging. The attachment was gone, but the discussion remained. Once the vote concludes, emphasize continuity rather than replacement. Avoid language suggesting conflict with the founder. Employees should feel this was a natural evolution. Natural evolution, not removal. The narrative had already been written, exactly as the note on the visitor badge predicted. Narrative first, vote second. Emily from the lab found me that afternoon, nervous, glancing at the hallway. Mr. Hayes was touring the new manufacturing facility yesterday. He told the contractors that after next month's board meeting, he'd finally be able to make changes without interference. 6 people had heard it. None of them would likely testify. People rarely risk their careers for a leader they believe is already losing. That night, looking at an old photograph of David painting our first rented lab, badly, Emma asked what I was smiling about. I think I know why they're so confident, I said. They think they're buying a castle. And? They never checked who owns the land underneath it. She understood, before I finished the sentence. So they can fire you, she said. But they can't take everything. Not if the contracts say otherwise. Somewhere upstairs, Denise was rehearsing her speech. Ethan was imagining himself in my office, and the board believed next month's vote would end the story. None of them had thought to verify who actually owned the prize. By 8:30 on the appointed Monday, every parking spot outside headquarters was full. Sedans, SUVs, even a television van. Someone had leaked that a leadership announcement was coming, and communications had done its job well. I carried only one leather folder, no laptop, no slides, no stack of financials. Denise stood first. "No founder can carry an organization forever," she said, the room nodding along to a speech she'd clearly rehearsed for months. "There comes a time when institutions must become larger than individuals." Ethan followed, thanking me with real-sounding gratitude, before pivoting, gently, to inevitability. No insults, no anger, just a story engineered so the room would believe this was evolution, not betrayal, exactly as the post-transition messaging document had instructed. The chairman read the motion. "Effective immediately, Caroline Hayes shall be removed as Chief Executive Officer. Ethan Hayes shall assume executive leadership upon approval." Hands rose. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 7, Martin's hesitating half a second before joining them. "The motion carries," the chairman said. No applause. Just the quiet relief of people who believed an uncomfortable task had finally ended. Legal counsel slid the folder toward me. I opened it, then closed it again, and said nothing. "I hope someday you'll understand this wasn't personal," Ethan said. I smiled. Small, calm, completely out of place in that room. And Denise noticed immediately, her eyes narrowing. "You seem surprisingly composed." "I am." I looked to the chairman. "Before I leave, I'd like legal to answer one question." I slid a single certified page across the table. Not the full agreement. Just Appendix 9. Jonathan, our general counsel, glanced at it casually, then read it again, his expression changing exactly the way it had months earlier, when I'd mentioned Exhibit G. "Where did you get this?" "I signed it, 12 years ago." "I'll need to verify." "Please do." Denise demanded to know what it said. He wouldn't speculate. He asked for a few minutes. Ethan laughed once, short and dismissive. "That's impossible." But the attorney kept reading, and the room went very quiet. The kind of quiet that follows people realizing they might not even understand the beginning of their own story. "It suggests," Jonathan finally said, "that the company's intellectual property may not have been assigned in the manner we believed. If this document is authentic, then today's vote may have removed the chief executive officer, without determining who actually controls the assets that generate roughly 83% of this company's value." Nobody moved. I stood, collected my folder, and buttoned my coat. "I won't interrupt your meeting," I said. "I imagine you suddenly have quite a bit to discuss." As I reached the door, I heard the words I'd been waiting months to hear. "Before anyone signs another document, I recommend we suspend all implementation until ownership can be independently verified." I didn't turn around. The vote they'd spent a year preparing had finally happened, and in less than 3 minutes, every ounce of certainty they'd built around it had begun to collapse. I expected anger. I expected panic. What I got instead was the heavier kind of silence. The kind that settles over intelligent people realizing they may have spent months acting on a single false assumption. By the time I reached my office, my phone had already logged 3 missed calls. I let it wait. 45 minutes later, Jonathan appeared at my door, jacket unbuttoned, tie crooked, looking like a man who'd reread the same page 20 times, hoping the words would change. "I've spoken with outside counsel," he said. "We searched our digital archives. No assignment agreement. Physical storage? Nothing. I contacted the patent registry. The listed owner remains Caroline Hayes Intellectual Holdings. Not the board. Not Ethan. My holding company, exactly as Harold had said. I don't understand how everyone missed this," he said, rubbing his forehead. "Because no one was looking," I told him. For 12 years the company had paid maintenance fees, defended the patents, licensed the technology, and everyone had simply assumed that using something for over a decade meant owning it. It didn't. There's a difference. A very expensive one. "Did you know?" Jonathan asked. I could have let him believe I'd planned this from the start. Instead, I told him the truth. No. I'd rediscovered it less than a week earlier. I built a company. I buried my husband. I raised my daughter. I assumed legal had completed the transfer years ago. He sat back. "I believe you," he said. "I wish I didn't." The chairman arrived next, looking older than he had that morning. "We have a problem," he said. And then, without defensiveness, "I owe you an apology. The board relied on incomplete information." "You relied on information you never verified," I corrected, and he accepted it without argument. He asked whether I'd attend another meeting that afternoon. With the board, with Ethan, with Denise. I agreed, not to defend myself, but to explain the documents. At 3 o'clock, the room felt entirely different. No one checked their phones. Jonathan projected a timeline. The licensing structure remained active. No subsequent assignment had ever been located, and the board had no evidence that legal ownership of the core patents had ever transferred to Hayes Biotech. Denise insisted there had to be an administrative explanation. Every answer Jonathan gave closed another door. Digital archives searched, physical archives searched, external counsel contacted. Finally, Ethan looked at me directly. "So what are you saying? That you still own everything?" "I'm saying the paperwork says what it says. You planned this." I rediscovered it. It nearly destroyed the company just as much as it protects me now. Then Jonathan displayed a set of internal emails recovered from the archived servers, a full communications plan prepared weeks before the board had ever formally discussed leadership. The room grew colder with every slide. Lies don't collapse all at once. They crack, then splinter, and finally the people who built them start contradicting each other. That afternoon, no one in the boardroom was looking at me anymore. They were looking at Denise. "When were these transition documents commissioned?" the chairman asked. "Contingency materials," Denise said smoothly. Jonathan corrected her. The metadata showed they'd been created 34 days before any formal discussion appeared on the board agenda, with multiple revisions since. Then he enlarged a document titled Founder Transition Narrative, position leadership change as a natural evolution rather than a governance conflict, avoid language implying disagreement with Dr. Hayes, reinforce continuity through repeated references to succession planning. 5 weeks old, before performance had ever been reviewed, before anyone had officially proposed replacing me. Martin spoke up, shaken. "I've seen this language before. In investor briefing notes. I thought communications had board approval." They hadn't. Ethan turned on Denise. "You told me this had already been cleared. I said we were preparing. You said the board had already agreed. I said perception was moving in that direction. For the first time in months, my brother sounded less like a man in control and more like someone realizing he'd confused confidence with certainty." Then came the email that ended any pretense. Instructions to keep positioning Ethan as the operational face of the company while maintaining Caroline's ceremonial role until governance is finalized. Ceremonial. That was what I had been reduced to in their plan. The founder they'd keep smiling for photographs while someone else quietly ran everything real. One independent director said quietly that he didn't remember approving this strategy. Another agreed. A third said he'd never even seen these communications. Ethan stood. "I need some air." No one stopped him. For months he'd believed he was walking toward the future. Now he wasn't sure whether he'd been leading the plan or simply following someone else's script. "Dr. Hayes," the chairman said. My title, for the first time all day. "As of this moment, the board's previous vote is suspended. An independent legal review will begin immediately. No executive transition will proceed until ownership, governance, and internal conduct have been fully examined." One by one, the directors nodded, not because I had won, but because they finally understood they'd never been given the complete picture at all. The independent review moved fast, because documents don't take sides. By Monday, outside counsel delivered its findings. No executed assignment had ever transferred ownership of the foundational patents from my holding company to Hayes Biotech, and the board had never been informed of the distinction. The company retained broad licensing rights. It did not, the attorney said carefully, appear to hold legal ownership of the underlying intellectual property. Everyone in the room understood exactly what that meant, without looking at me at all. Ethan asked to speak privately, and we met in David's old office. "I didn't know," he said, standing at the window. I believed him. Not completely, but enough. "I don't think you wrote the contracts. I think you stopped asking questions once the answers benefited you." He nodded, eyes down. "After David died, everyone looked at you. The scientists, the investors, the employees. I was always just the brother." His voice cracked. "I never wanted to destroy you. I only wanted one chance." "You had thousands," I told him. You just wanted mine." When he left, he looked older than he had a week before. Not because he'd lost power, but because he'd finally stopped pretending he deserved it the way David had. Denise came to see me with a single envelope. "I've resigned. I assumed you would. I truly believed I was saving the company. By removing its founder, by professionalizing it. I thought founders eventually become obstacles." "Some do," I said. "Not all. You confused control with stability." She laughed, tired and almost relieved. "I suppose I did." We shook hands, not as family, not as allies, as two professionals whose paths had finally run out. I never saw her again. 3 weeks later, the board unanimously offered to reinstate me as CEO. "We owe you the opportunity to lead without interference," the chairman said. I thanked him and declined. The room went still. "I built this company to discover medicines," I said. "Somewhere along the way I started managing meetings instead of science. I don't want to spend 10 years winning boardroom votes. I want to spend them finding treatments." Nobody argued, because they finally understood. Power had never been my destination. It had only ever been the vehicle. Emma was waiting outside, leaning against the car with David's old impatient smile. "So? I turned it down," she laughed. "They spent weeks trying to get rid of you. And now you walk away?" "I didn't walk away," I said, looping my arm through hers. "I chose where I wanted to stand. Where to now? We're going home. And tomorrow, I'm going back to the lab. For the first time in over a year, that answer felt completely right. People still ask whether I regret it. Not the meeting, not the investigation, not the months spent wondering if I was losing my mind. They ask if I regret building Hayes Biotech at all. My answer never changes. No. Companies don't betray people. People do. And even then, not all of them. The board eventually hired an experienced executive from outside the company, not because they distrusted family, but because they'd learned leadership shouldn't belong to one bloodline or one carefully written narrative. I unlocked Laboratory 3 before sunrise the first morning back, and Emily looked up, smiling. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come. I said I would. It smelled like glass, alcohol, fresh coffee, and possibility. For the first time in years, I felt like myself." Ethan wrote to me 3 months later. A handwritten letter, no excuses, no legal language. He admitted ambition had slowly outpaced gratitude, that he'd stopped asking hard questions because the easy answers benefited him. Near the end, he wrote, "The hardest part wasn't losing the position. It was realizing I had spent so much time trying to become someone else that I forgot who I already was." I never wrote back. Not out of anger. Some apologies don't need a reply, only a changed life. I heard he left the corporate world a year later and began teaching entrepreneurship at a small university, where people say he speaks often about ethics. I hope that's true. The investigation concluded Denise had never forged a document or broken a law in any dramatic sense. She had simply let certainty replace verification, believed she knew best, and stopped asking whether she had the right to decide. It won't make headlines. It can still destroy trust. The holding company stayed exactly where it had always been, not as a weapon, not as revenge. The board and I negotiated a long-term agreement that finally reflected reality. The patents kept supporting Hayes Biotech, patients kept receiving new treatments, and scientists kept working without interruption. I demanded no impossible fees. I dismantled nothing out of spite. Revenge rarely heals anything. It just becomes another story. Someone else has to survive. Nearly 2 years after the vote, Emma and I stood outside the old warehouse where David and I had started everything, now converted into artist studios, the faded blue door still there. "You miss the beginning?" she asked. "I miss believing success would solve everything," I said. It didn't. It just gave us bigger problems. We laughed the way you only can. Once enough time has passed for pain to become perspective. "What do you think Dad would be proudest of?" she asked. Not the patents, not the company, not even the fact that the truth eventually came out, that we never had to lie to win, I said. People still ask how I knew the truth would come out. I didn't. I fought because the documents deserved to be read before the decisions were made. Evidence first, assumptions later. The same lesson science taught me decades ago. Stories can be rehearsed. Reputations can be managed. Narratives can be manufactured. But facts wait patiently. They don't get louder with time. They simply remain true, until someone willing to look closely enough finds them. And when they do, the truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be read.